Good morning and welcome to City Legal. My name is Peter Wrench. Whether you're joining us online because you're working from home or you've got a small gathering at your workplace or in a cafe, or whether you're here in person, a very warm welcome to you. City Legal exists to consider the bigger questions of life with silks and suits right around Australia, and we do that by looking at the Bible together. The format, for those of you who are new, and a special welcome to you, is a short talk followed by a Q&A. You can ask questions at any time by using the chat function at the base of your Zoom screen, or you can write a question down if you're here. Now, we're incredibly privileged to have with us again Michael Kellahan, the Executive Director of Freedom for Faith, and he's going to be doing the second part of his two-part series on a Christian take on politics. But he's actually asked that a section from the biography of Jesus, written by Mark, be read. So Lisa's going to come up now and read that, and then I'm going to invite Michael to come and speak for us.
Mark 12, 13 to 17. Later, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to Jesus to catch him in his words. They came to him and said, "Teacher, we know you're a man of integrity. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are, but you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we?" But Jesus knew their hypocrisy. "Why are you trying to trap me?" he asked. "Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." They brought the coin, and he asked them, "Whose image is it, and whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. Then Jesus said to them, "Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." And they were amazed at him.
Thanks, Lisa. Thank you, Peter. It's good to be here again this morning. Well, last week we started a little series on a Christian take on politics, and this week, last week really was just kind of clearing the ground, saying Christians need to see politics as part of life, something that we should be speaking into, and to really make it difficult for ourselves, I want to tackle the contentious kind of issue of the cries that are taking place at the moment for racial justice. Now, I know even as I do that, that's an issue which has caused unbelievable consternation over the last month. Walking here this morning, I went past the statues in Hyde Park and was making sure to photograph a couple of them, not sure if they'll be there again in a few weeks. Who would have thought that 2020 would have the shape that it has? In fact, it was a month ago today that George Floyd was killed. And since that time, and that horrible video, him dying there on camera, a video that my kids saw before I'd seen it, and it kind of gone around the world, his pleading last words, "I can't breathe," now memorialised in all kinds of places, that we'd see thousands marching. We'd see this massive growth of Black Lives Matter. We'd see the setting up of autonomous zones, whatever they might be, in the States. We'd see statues torn down and thrown into the river. We'd see the mobilisation of the National Guard again in the States. But it's not just an American thing. This death that took the pandemic off the front page is something that has found local expression all over the place, including Sydney, including Australia. Thousands marching, and that global crying out for racial justice. One that brought up all the kind of echoes for us of the, inquiry into Aboriginal deaths in custody and what's happened and what's continuing to happen in this place. There have been deaths before, they've been filmed before, there have been protests before, but there does seem to be something newer and bigger here. There seems to be a wide-scale kind of collapse of trust in the institutions to get things right and fixed up. And I think that's behind a lot of the tearing down of statues that's taking place. People are signalling a desire to break with the evils of the past and to set up something which is new. That's what revolutions kind of always do, isn't it? It's kind of a tearing down of the symbols of what's been and a desire to build something new. Now, you might think that's a very dangerous revolutionary thing. You might think that kind of hope for a utopia, that idea that you can create a year zero by just cancelling out the past, is the thing that only and always just leads to bloodshed in the streets. Or you might think, this thrills my heart. You know, this is something that gives me great joy. And, you know, I've had Christian friends on both sides of that political divide, looking at what's happened and interpreting it in that kind of way. So what might a Christian political response look like? What should it look like? Now, in the very limited time which we've got here, we're not going to come to a concrete answer on that, but it's a question that we've got to ask and that we've got to keep talking about. I want to sketch out just some things. The first is to say that cries for racial justice have to be welcomed as a good thing. When Jesus teaches what the law is all about, he says, well, it's about loving God and it's about loving your neighbour. The most famous story he teaches to show what loving your neighbour is the story of the Good Samaritan. And you can't understand that story unless you first understand the animosity there is between Jews and Samaritans, the hatred with which they felt for each other, and the way that Jesus says that the great hero of the story is the one who's seen as the member of the despised ethnic minority who believes the wrong kind of things. The one who everyone should hate is the one who turns out to be the hero. He looks to a reconciliation there where everyone else is wanting to bring division. Now, that would have been very challenging for them at that time to hear that in ways that I think we're slow to appreciate. And the anger and the pain and the grief that's felt by our Aboriginal brothers and sisters on this issue is one that we should be quick to listen to as well and slow to speak. I remember sitting down with some Aboriginal pastors just a year ago talking about a whole range of things, and as they talked about what life was like for them, they just were recounting a long series of funerals that they were taking, just a long series of people who just died too young. And then they were talking about the people that they were visiting in prison, and there were too many that they were doing that. And it just struck me how different the kind of pattern of pastoral ministry it was, and yet how normal it was for them in that place. And these are people who are grieving at the moment. There's been a strong Christian response by some in the States, but also here, that wants to push back against any kind of protest like that. Now, some by minimising it, by saying there's no real problem with racism, some by saying this is just driven by people who are woke and social justice warriors or culturally Marxist, and, you know, just look to the kind of things that these people believe. We can't endorse these kind of things. They point to the Black Lives Matter organisation, whose founders are quite open about their own Marxist commitments and their desire to bring revolution. And they say, well, you can't endorse that as a Christian. And they're right in that there's no place for endorsing that kind of platform. You read the Black Lives Matter organisation and you see that it sees Christianity itself as part of the problem. But this cry for justice and this movement is bigger than any Marxist organisation. And most of the people in the streets have no idea what cultural Marxism or anything like that might be, but are just outraged at the scale of injustice that's seen and that's experienced from the police. In other words, here is a good cause, the right cause that Christians should be not be scared off of because of the concerns of others or because of the strategy of others. We have something different and distinctive to say. Different hopes, different beliefs, different strategies. But a need to speak into this space and into this moment. We must be very suspicious of beliefs that we can bring about a revolutionary future by tearing down the past. That, for me, just smacks of an inadequate kind of understanding of how big a problem sin is, how big a problem racism actually is, and what a foolish kind of idea that you can just bring about a utopia by tearing down a statue and constructing something which is new. Beware thinking that we can remove the sins of our fathers by that, and beware a very flat reading of history like that. I think it's helpful for us to think of Australia and what's going on here, and to realise that there is an issue here that needs to be addressed from the question of justice. The Aboriginal imprisonment rate, many of you will know, 17 times higher than the national average. The children alienated from their families at unprecedented rates. The youth are languishing in detention centres in obscene numbers. The ones who should be the hope for the future are instead the ones who aren't being educated, who are being separated from their families, who are being imprisoned. And it starts from birth. Indigenous child mortality is twice the rate of non-Indigenous children. The majority of Indigenous students are only going to school 4 days a week. Indigenous employment rate, 49% compared to 75%. All the kind of close the gap measures in report after report after report are very depressing kind of reading. The most important one, the life expectancy rate, is just, it's not on track. It's almost like we've got two countries that are trying to live together. Or are we? I think that's the challenge. Do we actually want to live together like that? Now, there is something deeply wrong when you see statistics like that, when you see a world like that, and it comes to more than just individual acts of racism. It's not just, you know, that racism is found in this one bad person over here who has a bad heart and says these things. It's that the structures, the institutions that we see, the history that we've embedded and that we've built the nation on actually has racism wrapped within it. Now, it's not the whole story, and that's the tricky thing. I think there is a kind of black armband view that says that's all that we are to say about our history, that's all that we are to say about our institutions. And if that were the case, it'd be easy to dismiss that. It's more complicated than that, because we see that people who themselves aren't racist are still being able to benefit from a system that historically has been built on racial discrimination and oppression. It's a systemic way of thinking about that. Now, we might pick that up in questions given the limited time which are there, but it needs to have, I think we need a view of history which is bigger than a hashtag. You know, we need to understand our own history. Now, one of the best books I've ever seen and ever read on this is a book called One Blood by John Harris. And if I could do just one thing from this talk, and that was to get just one of you to read that book, I'd feel like my mission was accomplished. It's out of print. They're waiting for a reprint, but it's on Kindle. It's even on sale at $9.99. Wonderful book that tells the story of Aboriginal encounters with Christianity over the nation's history. And it shows how the kind of horror we have about racism now wasn't at all an obvious thing. If you go back to 19th century Sydney, you see that the Christian position on race was actually at odds with the secular elite at the time. Most of them had imbibed a spirit of social Darwinism that said that the races are very different, and you have a very much a hierarchy of races. And what you will see over the 19th century, they said, was a dying out of these people. Now, at worst, that led to poisoning of wells and massacres and things like that. At best, it was a kind of benign paternalism that said, well, let's ease them out of that way of life and introduce them into us as a nation. And with that way of thinking did come terrible harm to so many people. So the Mile Creek Massacre, when that happened, one of the jurors afterwards said this, let me quote, "I look on the blacks as a set of monkeys. The sooner they are exterminated from the earth, the better. I would never consent to hang a white man for a black man. I knew well they were guilty of murder, but I, for one, would never see a white man suffer for shooting a black." So there's a juror in the criminal trial, the Mile Creek Massacre, who has taken on that social Darwinism of the day that said these people are actually subhuman, and it's okay for whites to treat blacks like that. Now that's reported in the press at the time, and it wasn't a scandalous thing that the person had said that. It was actually just the way that people thought. But the churches took a different position. 100% Protestant Catholic took a different position that said these people are of one blood with us. Now, it might be a kind of low bar to say they did well by saying they were human, but they did something which was against the science of the time, the culture of the time, by saying these people are made in the image of God. And so the Attorney General at the time brought a second trial against another of the accused, and he was a devout Catholic. He was one of the founders of St Vincent's and of Sydney Grammar, one of the early vice-chancellors of Sydney Uni, and he believed all should be equal before the law, and therefore he acted, as a lawyer in that place in that time out of his Christian beliefs. Beliefs that were founded largely from a verse in Acts which says, in the Old King James, God hath made of one blood all nations to dwell upon the face of the earth. Acts 17:26. Paul there preaching in Athens is saying that there is just one blood. It's a very visceral kind of way of seeing what humanity is, but saying that those distinctions that we make are not ones that God is recognising. We actually need to see people as precious and made in the image of God. And if you see them like that, then you won't be poisoning wells. You won't be taking part in massacres, nor will you be condoning those that do. It'll actually see you caring about this image. And so Christians spoke up, even though people sneered at their primitive beliefs, thought that they were enemies of progress. They kept saying, one blood, one blood, one blood. Hence the title of John Harris's book, One Blood. Something that comes up in the diaries of the time, in the stories of Aboriginals who came to faith, of things in the mission. Again and again and again, this verse is quoted. And there are failings in the Australian church on this, the missions. It's quite a mixed kind of story. But this one they got absolutely right. And I think we need a 21st century appropriation of that kind of thinking, of what it would look like for Christians to be prepared to be out of step with the culture and to say, you've got this wrong. We've actually got a better way of understanding what it means to be human, what it means to be in the image of God, what it means for everyone to be precious, what it means for us to love our neighbour, and what that means in the context of our first Australian brothers and sisters. And it's not going to be something as banal as pulling down a statue. It's going to be something really important. And it's going to be slow, and it's going to be long, and it's going to take a retelling of story based on truth, and it's going to mean that we've got to start by actually caring about this, by learning stories, by praying about this, by acting. And I think particularly speaking into a legal context, there's all kinds of immediate ways we can think about how that lands in terms of pro bono work, in terms of legal reform, in terms of care for those who can't do much themselves, in terms of sentencing reform, in terms of all kinds of areas like that. Now, I'm over time. I've said about half the things I had planned to say, and I'm hoping that there's some questions there. So I'm handing back to Pete, who's going to throw it open to questions, and we'll start taking them. Thanks, mate.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Well, we do have a couple of questions that have come in already. I'm going to start with this one, and then I'll go and collect some more. And please, if you'd like to write a question down, just use the chat function at the base of your screen. But this question's come from Melbourne. Could you comment on critical race theory and how it is relevant or otherwise to the BLM movement and how Christians might respond to it? Do you want me to repeat the question? Or is that okay?
Yeah, I'd say this. I'd say I don't want to comment on critical race theory. I don't want to comment on cultural Marxism. I want to talk about Jesus. And I want the understanding of what it means to follow Jesus to frame our approach to race on this thing. And I think it is an absolute distraction for us to go down the rabbit hole of, what about this belief? What about that belief that some in this context might hold? So yeah, critical race theory comes out of, you will find it within the Black Lives Matter organisation. You'll find it from some on the left who are pushing that agenda. What I'm saying is that's not a Christian agenda, but we mustn't allow other people's wrong understandings to scare us off things that are really important and quite central to the Christian faith. That's what I say. If we tear down history, are not the Bible and Christianity very vulnerable? We cannot tear down history. I think we can keep retelling stories and figuring out, better ways to understand the history. But the idea that we can just create a kind of year zero by pulling down statues, that will lead to blood in the streets. I'm no fan of that at all. I think that should be clear. Christians have a duty to do justice to individuals, but is there not also a Christian duty to provide order so that the vulnerable are protected? Yes, I think that's right. And I don't think you can have, you need to be able to run together justice and order and peace and truth. And how do you do that in a fallen world? It's hard work. That's the kind of space that we're in at the moment. What is the Christian position on the Barabbas politics of 2020? Seems that the good desire for justice is compromised, tainted by the bad desire for violence and disorder. Yeah, that's a fair comment, I think. I think when you see people take to the streets, you will and set up autonomous zones, declare themselves lawless and apart from the state, that only invites a law and order response. It only invites a kind of pushback and a worsening of conditions for everyone. People think of the big riots in the 60s and things like that, and think that the 60s are this time of leftist progressive politics. Well, all of those riots, all of that revolution brought conservative politics to the fore almost everywhere. It was actually a time where there's a big pushback that's taking place. Sorry, my chairman's calling in. I must have said something very wrong. Patrick Parkinson, if you're watching, I'll take your question later. What are your views on liberation theology, particularly in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement? Again, I say that that's not liberation theology, which comes largely out of South America in the 50s and 60s, into the 70s, isn't the way forward. It's got connections to Marxism. The problem, and I've read Gustavo Gutierrez and some liberation theology. The problem for me is it never answers the question, who is the sinner that's being saved? In liberation theology, it's for the poor, and they're the ones who get saved, but does that mean they're the sinners? Well, no, you wouldn't want to say they're the sinners in liberation theology. Is it the rich? Well, no, the rich are the ones that you kind of want to overthrow. You don't want to say that God has a preferential option for the rich. And so there's a confusion there where the political categories have kind of overtaken and confused the gospel ones. But again, I say, let's not be distracted by people coming with wrong answers and say, well, because other people are giving wrong diagnosis and wrong cures, there's no disease here, there's no sickness, there's nothing to be kind of worked on. If we know better, then do better. Then speak into the space with a distinctively Christian hope and witness. I think that's the thing we're to be doing. The thing that I have heard people say is, well, because of liberation theology's concern for the poor, we shouldn't be concerned for the poor. Well, that's nuts, frankly. That's not the way forward. Should we be trying to benefit from a new heaven and a new earth now rather than waiting for the next life? I'm not sure what benefit for means in that context, but certainly we said last week, any kind of understanding of Christian take on politics has to keep in mind the kingdom of God, which is coming, and the idea that we have a hope that we are waiting for. Now, that's not to say we don't do anything now, but it is to say we don't expect the kingdom of God here and now as the answer to our problems. If joining cultural Marxists and Black Lives Matter protests is unhelpful, should Christians do public things to assist in improving race relations? Yeah, look, I think this is a place where we do need to be public and to be vocal and to be heard. But I think first we need to be listening. We actually need to be alongside the people who are Christian in this space and wanting to do the right things and to be there with them. And I think that may mean public partnership with people that do share different beliefs. I mean, I think in the religious freedom context, that's something that Freedom for Faith does all the time, which we're working alongside people who have different beliefs in order, to see common good stuff being done. And I think the same would apply here. Yeah, there's a question on Dyson Hayden, which I'm not going to touch. Someone can ask me later if they want to. That's what I've got here. Thanks, Pete.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much for tuning in, everyone. Just to let you know that City Legal is going to be on break for 3 weeks, so winter break, and we return on the 23rd of July. David Robertson will be speaking on what's the point of the law, and we're going to be live streaming from the Hotel Currajong in Canberra. So I look forward to seeing you then.